comment box, or members of your trade union branch, or people that you work with who'll be interested in a socialist alternative to the capitalist chaos revealed by the coronavirus crisis, your family, anyone that you can think of really. We're going to try and build the audience a little bit before we get started, because we think it's really, really important that a socialist alternative is put. I mean, every day we're getting these broadcasts, these briefings from the Tory ministers. I mean, sometimes it feels like they're just recycling old announcements, trying to give the impression that they are, ready for action, when what we can see is that everything is too little, too late in what they do. So I think we're ready to get started now. Just again, welcome everybody to this broadcast. It's the Socialist Party. We're going to try and do these on a regular basis every week. Today, the topic is how the coronavirus crisis reveals the need for socialist planning. I'm Sarah Sachs-Eldridge. I'm the Socialist Party's national organiser, and I'm going to be joined today by Hannah Sell, who is the Socialist Party's General Secretary. Hi Hannah, can you hear me?
Hi Sarah, yes I can, I think, yeah.
So we're going to start in a moment. I'm just going to get the okay from the team. I mean, there are millions of issues that we could try and deal with today, but we're going to go with the need for socialist planning. But we want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. We want to hear your comments. We want to hear what you think. We want to hear what's going on in your workplace, in your area, in your community, and so on. So you can do that by commenting in the comment boxes below, or by getting in touch with us, info@socialistparty.org.uk. And like I say, we want to hear from you. But also, I have to say that we're going to be taking this as we go today a little bit. It's an experiment for us. Today I'm going to read out questions, but I'm also going to be trying to answer the questions and trying to involve Hannah in answering the questions as well, and we hope that that will work. We're much more used in the Socialist Party to talking to people, to having meetings where we can sit and discuss together, where we can present ideas, hear from each other, and draw conclusions so that we can act. That's our method in the Socialist Party, but obviously that is not possible today. So we're new to the technology, we're new to the format, but we hope that it works. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the first question and then start to answer it, and then Hannah can also come in and we'll take it from there if that's okay. So people might be like me, they get up on a Sunday morning and they watch the Marr show on the BBC, or you might be more normal. But anyway, the Andrew Marr show goes out every Sunday morning from BBC One. And a couple of Sundays ago, they always have people on from the newspapers and so on to read that week's newspapers and to comment on it. And they had the editor of the Financial Times on this particular Sunday, talking about all the coverage of the coronavirus. And at the end of her contribution, she just said, well, of course, Andrew, this is nothing to do with a failure of capitalism or a failure of the free market. And Marr just goes, that's right, and moves on to the next subject. No question, no doubt, no engagement with the question at all. And obviously that is a question that people have in their heads, isn't it? So I wanted to start by addressing that issue, because Ruler Khalif might assert that it's not a failure of capitalism, that it's not a failure of the free market. That might be the position of the Financial Times. But she was lucky that Marr isn't interested in discussing the failings of capitalism and the need for a socialist alternative, because that is posed in every aspect of this crisis. The first thing that we need to say here is that it's posed by the actions of the capitalist class themselves, the governments, the pro-capitalist governments that exist around the world. In their actions, they're admitting that their way of organising hasn't worked. The huge measures that they've taken show how they are just throwing out of the window all of the policies of the last 30 years or more of neoliberalism. The Tories have, their raison d'etre, hasn't it been to drive through privatisation, but now we see them nationalising railways, and we're seeing similar measures across the world. The mantra has been, of the last 10 years and before that, there's no money for public services. Private run services are the best there is, despite all the evidence that there's been to the contrary. But now they've abandoned that approach. Well, we'll discuss exactly how much. But the measures have been eye-watering in their scale. For one thing, around the world, something like 40% of the world's population is in lockdown, either voluntary or enforced. That is in itself is huge. In the US, Congress has prepared a package worth almost $2 trillion. That's 10% of GDP. That's twice what they promised to deal with the world economic crisis in 2007-2009. That's the biggest fiscal stimulus in modern history. Central banks are printing money. In France, the government that has been known widely in the population as the government of the rich has just taken on the power to manage prices and requisition goods. And for decades, we've been told that big government is an obstacle to progress, and we just need to let the market decide. But we're seeing very clearly that decisive action is necessary to protect society's health and safety. And we're seeing that action from governments, from big business, pro-capitalist governments, is too little too late. And that's because the profit motive hasn't itself been eliminated. That's why the banks aren't cooperating with the meagre help promised to small businesses. That's why the production of personal protection equipment and tests has been delayed. That's why furloughed workers face a 20% pay cut. We say, the Socialist Party says, and we've produced this workers' charter, which you can order below as well. We say that workers must not pay the price for the coronavirus crisis, that all workers forced to self-isolate or not in work should immediately receive 100% of their normal income, and that nobody should lose their job, and that those already sacked should be reinstated. Of course, the Socialist Party welcomes every measure that protects society from this virus, both the health and the economic implications. But we have to point out that for all their spending and promises, this remains a government of big business. When forced to recognise the level of the crisis, governments around the world have had to abandon their neoliberal hands-off policies, letting the market decide, in favour of state intervention and spending. And they're acting somewhere similar to how governments acted during the wars, the world wars. And they were forced, weren't they, really? What we saw was a change in direction. They were forced by the situation to do a U-turn in their policies and to take action, because that wasn't the starting point of the Johnson government, and although that action still remains limited and inadequate. Because initially we heard this stuff, didn't we, about herd immunity, that testing wasn't necessary, that they basically, government wouldn't have to act, that it would take its own course. And we've seen Trump start off like that, but similarly make a U-turn. And now the government is faced with mounting questions of why workers in Britain are left so vulnerable to this disease without adequate PPE, testing, and confidence that self-isolation won't leave them destitute and so on. And the government is scrambling to be seen to be acting. But we had a briefing yesterday, April the 2nd, with Matt Hancock returned from isolation. But it left many, many questions unanswered. He's the health minister. He didn't have facts, he didn't have guarantees, and that's because they still remain a government committed to big business first rather than society's safety. On question time, he even admitted that they're not even counting the numbers of nurses who have been killed by this crisis. He had the number of doctors, but not the number of nurses. And one of the things that he did clearly was he bemoaned the fact that Britain doesn't have a diagnostic industry. And it was almost like decisions and policies of capitalist politicians weren't a factor in that situation. But it's long been Tory policy to smash up the manufacturing industry in Britain, going back to Thatcher, and to rely on imports from places where working conditions are worse, to keep costs low for British big business and undermine the fighting strength of the trade unions here. But obviously the working class has fought that in the miners' strike, with the Lucas Plan, and in many other battles. And now there's a crisis of ventilator production that's been discussed widely in the press. Doctors are being told horrendously that they may have to choose who they will help to live and who they're going to let die in this situation. But that decision is down to the failure of capitalism and the market, the failure to invest in ventilator production, to prepare in advance because it wasn't cost efficient, to invest in masks and disinfectant in tests. It's not just down to the stupidity of individuals. It's because the first instinct of capitalism, of the capitalist class, is to put the profits and wealth of the capitalist class first, which means not intervening to prevent the suffering of the working class and poor. And the figures are piling up, aren't they? This virus is appalling, and we regret all of that suffering and those deaths. But we also regret the deaths by hunger, by lack of access to clean water, by women giving birth in poverty, and the deaths in childbirth that leads to, and all the millions of unnecessary deaths that take place every year because the wealth and the resources of the planet are not allocated on the basis of need, but hoarded by the tiny handful of people who make up the capitalist class, the big business boss class, and that they have the power in their hands to make decisions, and that it isn't in the hands of the working class. I mean, this is slightly off point, but I noticed kind of between the coronavirus headlines, there's been a story about Monsanto, the company that developed weed killer in the decades ago, I think starting in the 60s in the Vietnam War. And it was warned that the weed killer they produced would cause major problems. And they knew that from the start. But they carried on that it would cause problems for health and for land. But they hid that info because profits come first. That is the way the capitalist system works. So it is in that general approach that it's, hands off, they only plan to prioritise profit and only do what they're forced to do. That is their approach. You can see that in food production, you can see it everywhere. And basically what we're talking about is what socialists often call the cold cruelty of the capitalist class and their representatives in the Tory party, among the Blairites as well. And that decides to make the working class pay for their crises. We saw that after the 2007-2008 world economic crisis, and we also saw it as part of the economic crisis that this pandemic is bringing in. We will also see it, as part of the economic crisis that this pandemic is bringing in its wake. All the features of capitalism, its short-termism, its contradictions, all contributed to this crisis. But there's always going to be an attempt to make the working class pay. And amongst the discussions, amongst those defenders of capitalism, you can see hints of this. One of the writers in the Telegraph, the Tory newspaper, said that governments have got to go a little bit socialist now to defend the capitalist system, to maintain and save neoliberalism. That's what they're hoping they can do. That's what they want to do. They want to take these measures now in the hope of shoring up their system. But that's why we're saying that the working class has got to fight. Fight today for the protection that it needs, but organise and build on that struggle going into the future to make sure that we don't pay for this crisis in its aftermath, and to start to take the running of society into the democratic hands of the working class. That is what is necessary. And we can see from this, I think one of the lessons that we can get from this crisis is that there's the failures of capitalism and the market system to be able to respond to the needs of society, but also that to do that they need to be forced. They need to be forced to change the strategy, to take measures in society's interests, and that requires them to fear that their right to rule might be challenged. And that is what is posed by this crisis. And these measures are going to raise in the minds of billions of people across the planet, if they can do it now, why can't they do it for us? And if they can't do it, why can't we? So I think that is going to be where we go next in this discussion. That is going to require a struggle for the socialist transformation of society, and that requires the building of a mass working class movement, mass independent working class organisations with a socialist programme to start to transform society, to defend and protect the health and the safety and the future of all of humanity and the environment. Hannah, you might have some things that you want to add on this question of, is it a failure of the market system and of capitalism?
Yeah, I don't want to add much really. I think Sarah has coped well with this very strange newsreader format we've adopted for today and has explained all of the main points. I would just make a couple of short points to illustrate what Sarah was saying, because it is an incredible U-turn by Boris Johnson, by Trump, by these capitalist leaders and governments around the world who have had to carry out state intervention on a gigantic scale. They've effectively nationalised the payrolls of their countries. That's what it means, what's been carried out, along with all of the other measures. These go far further than Jeremy Corbyn would have put forward, or Bernie Sanders in the US. And yet, you know, Johnson was calling Corbyn a Marxist fool a few weeks ago, and now he's been forced to go much further. But as Sarah said, they're doing it to prop up the capitalist system. They're not doing it to defend the interests of the majority or to look after ordinary people. And so one of the things is, when we talk about socialism, when we talk about the need for the public sector to grow, for the state to intervene more, we don't mean what they're doing, because always with them, it's run from the top in the interests of big business. Whereas what we're fighting for is nationalisation under democratic workers' control and management, so that it's ordinary, and we'll talk more about that, but so that it's ordinary people who are in control rather than a few at the top. But this is still the capitalist system, despite what they've been forced to do. And to give an illustration of that and how that means they're still not effective in fighting the virus, I've got here a printout from Forbes magazine, which lists 32 different companies around the world that are involved in trying to develop treatment or vaccines for the coronavirus. And no doubt the chemists who are working for these 32 different companies would like to be collaborating and sharing their data in order to be as effective as possible. But that is not what is happening. Why not? On Monday, Johnson & Johnson spread a rumour that they were starting to test a vaccine on human beings, and their share price jumped by 8% in a day. There are big profits to be made out of who finds a vaccine or an effective treatment for the coronavirus, so they're not sharing their information. What's the solution to that? It's for governments to step in and nationalise the pharmaceutical industry. But the government's not doing that. They've nationalised the railways and then given back the franchises, and they're paid for it, to the private companies who ran them before. And they've done that to prop up those companies because they would have collapsed otherwise. In other words, to defend big business. But the pharmaceutical industry is profitable in this crisis, and therefore, even though it clearly makes sense, in order to find a solution to the virus, they're not prepared to do it. Because ultimately, all these measures they're taking, no matter how far they go, are about defending private profit and the capitalist system. So that was just the point I wanted to add on that.
Okay, thanks very much, Hannah. I think that's really important that that was added. But I think people watching this, some might agree with every word we've said, but there might also be questions in people's heads, because we can all see the failures of capitalism, or at least all of us who have got eyes in our head, and the market system. But people will be saying, could socialist planning be better? What would you do differently? How could you deal with this natural phenomenon, this world crisis? What could be done differently? What would you say to that, Hannah?
Everything. A huge amount could be done differently. Look, this topic of how socialist planning could work is a very big topic, and I think we should have future broadcasts that are dealing with it as well. Perhaps people are going to have questions after today, and you should message them in, and then a future broadcast with me and Sarah, or other Socialist Party members maybe, could answer some of these issues in more depth. But part of this relates to the last discussion, because this is a crisis for the capitalist system, and how are big business responding to it? By being forced to abandon the normal methods of the capitalist system and to carry out measures of state intervention on a huge scale, because they're forced to recognise their system doesn't work to deal with this crisis, and therefore they have no choice but to carry out socialistic measures. Friedrich Engels, collaborator of Karl Marx, a very famous founding father of Marxism, described these kind of measures as the invading socialistic society, that capitalism doesn't work, so even the capitalists themselves are forced to partially move in this direction. But which bits of society have worked to deal with the crisis? It's the most socialist bits. It's the National Health Service. The NHS was set up as a result of a mass movement and mass anger from below after the Second World War by a Labour government, and it was a socialist measure. Big business opposed the establishment of the NHS. Since then, we've seen new Labour governments and Tory governments cut and privatise and sell off bits of the health service, so it's in a weakened state. But it is still, the whole of society understands this, even Johnson's forced to pay lip service to it. It is still the asset that is most effective in fighting back against this virus, because it still exists as a national health service which is free at the point of use and which provides treatment completely different to what workers in the US are facing with their terrible for-profit private health system. Internationally, Cuba, for example, doesn't have the workers' democracy that we would fight for, but nonetheless is still a state-directed economy, a tiny, tiny state-directed economy. It's a really little country, and yet Cuba has been sending doctors around the world, including to advanced capitalist countries like Italy. The drugs that they've produced in their state-owned laboratories are the most effective that exist at the moment for treating the coronavirus. That's also an example of how planning, even in a distorted way, has worked better than capitalism to deal with this crisis. And what else has been effective? Ordinary people, society, the collective. Maggie Thatcher, very famous Tory Prime Minister, removed from office by a mass movement that we led, the mass movement against the poll tax. But Maggie Thatcher said that there is no such thing as society. Johnson's been forced to retract that, say, oh yes, there is such a thing as society. And it's obvious, isn't it, in this crisis, in the hundreds and thousands of people who have volunteered to help the health service, to help to get food to the vulnerable, to deal with their care and so on, with the mutual aid societies that are springing up around the country, and also with the collective action of the working class, who in Northern Ireland, in Hull, in postal depots up and down the country, have had to go on strike to demand decent health and safety, and the same thing has been taking place on a global basis, but have a far better idea of how to act effectively to be safe and to make sure the people they deal with are safe in this crisis than their bosses, who are always interested in cutting costs and maximising profit. By the way, there have also been strikes of a different character, or a bit of a different character. I think Sarah might have referred to this, but General Electric workers in the US have been out on strike demanding that their switch to producing ventilators, because they know they've got the technological ability to do it and are willing to do that, as an indication of the collective desire, if you like, to fix this problem. So, capitalism is a blind system driven by the need to maximise short-term profits. Nothing else in the end matters for the capitalists. A socialist society would mean taking the major corporations and banks, it's about 150 in Britain, that dominate the economy, into democratic public ownership, but running them democratically under workers' democratic control and management, and using that to build a rational plan to meet the needs of society. And if there's one thing this crisis has shown, is austerity was a lie, because the money's there. We can afford decent wages for all. We can afford decent housing for all, free education. The money's there to do it, but the capitalists are not interested in doing that. They're interested in maximising their profits. But if we took the huge science and technique that capitalism has created and brought it into democratic public ownership, then we could meet the needs of humanity. We could have an NHS that's actually prepared to cope with pandemics, which, scientists have been warning was coming for a decade. We also, by the way, would be capable of the necessary switch to green technology in order to save the planet. Because before this crisis, there were hundreds and thousands of young people protesting, not only young people, but mainly young people, protesting to save our planet. And one of the conclusions that they are going to have drawn from this crisis is when your short-term profits are at stake, suddenly you can act. Why the hell can't you do something to save the planet? But the capitalist class are never going to take the necessary measures for a long-term crisis if they're going to affect their profits. It would require a socialist society to take the necessary measures to switch to green energy production and so on in order to protect the planet. The final point I'd make is that often when we're arguing these kind of points and we're pointing to the fact that it's working class people who actually keep society running, and that we would be capable collectively of building a new society in the interests of the majority instead of the profits of a few, people say, oh, rubbish, the working class is never going to do anything. Or what working class? The working class is divided into 100 different tiny little groups all fighting against each other. And of course it's true. Big business are a small minority in this society. They don't want us to all be acting together collectively. And they encourage division, whether it's between immigrant workers and other workers, or young and old, or those on permanent contracts and those on temporary contracts, and all of the other ways that they divide us. Those divisions exist. But hasn't this crisis shown to us as workers ourselves that we have more in common than divides us, but also that we do have power? Suddenly, society is forced to recognise who is it who keeps things running? Who are the essential workers? It's not the CEOs, it's not the Richard Bransons, it's the cleaners, it's the postal workers, it's all of the other essential workers that keep society running, and that we have enormous potential power and are capable of running society in the interests of the majority without the few at a top who are only interested in pursuing their own profits. So we are absolutely confident that this crisis is showing to millions of people in Britain and to billions around the world that a democratic socialist plan of production could work far more effectively than capitalism in meeting humanity's needs, and that working class people are capable of achieving that and carrying it out.
Thanks, Hannah. Inevitably, when we raise these ideas, clear as they are and necessary as they are, one of the arguments that gets put up to us is, well, that's all very well, but socialism failed. It failed wherever it was attempted, and socialism always ends in crisis and poverty and suffering. And I'll just make an attempt to start to answer that question. There's much more that can be said. In fact, there's books written on it, which I will mention. But it's incredible, isn't it? Given the level of crisis that capitalism brings, and repeated crisis as well, isn't it? The fact that we're facing this crisis and we're thinking back to previous crises, the 2007-2008 crisis, the Great Depression, and all the other crises that capitalism has seen, that there's those defenders of the system, or people who are afraid of looking for an alternative, who want to point to what happened in the Soviet Union, in Russia 100 years ago. And that's because it was the one time in history when the working class took power, over 100 years ago in October 1917, and the most important event in human history so far. But it's used, what came after that, is used over and over again to say that socialism is impossible, that socialist planning won't work, despite all the rational argument, the clear argument that Hannah has just put about that. And that's why it's really important that we do take up that issue, because there was degeneration of the Soviet Union into a brutal dictatorship, albeit one that still included a distorted form of a planned economy, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. But it's used to say that socialism was doomed to failure. And it's just milked and milked, isn't it, to say that, only capitalism is possible. That's what they tell us, isn't it? There's only one way of organising society. You might not like it. It might have to be refreshed and improved a bit, but capitalism is it. There is no alternative. That's been the mantra. But let's look at it properly. So capitalism has only existed for a few hundred years, 300 years or something. On the scale of human history, that is absolutely nothing. And it's true that capitalism has transformed the planet in that time. It's, incredible technology has been developed, some of which we're using now and are using in this crisis to communicate and so on. But so has devastating want, so has all the problems that we've just been discussing. And the point, though, that we're making is that capitalism is no more permanent than the systems that came before it, of feudalism and slavery and so on. And there's no reason to believe that this is the only way to organise society. So we have to take very seriously, like I said, the questions that people have about why the system in the Soviet Union degenerated, because we want to learn from that. We want to prepare ourselves for the transformation of society in a socialist direction, to prepare ourselves but by being armed with those lessons, because it wasn't a natural phenomenon that it automatically went from the Russian Revolution to a degenerated situation. Far from it. These are real concrete reasons that history took the course it did, based on objective factors and also subjective forces. And the Russian Revolution, there's not time to go into it here. People can read the books that have been written about it, especially Leon Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. There's a Socialist Party pamphlet on it. There was in 2017, this is our monthly magazine, Socialism Today, but in 2017 we had each issue had things about the Russian Revolution in it. But it was an incredible achievement, an achievement by working class people, through working class organisation, through the role of a revolutionary party, the role of a transitional programme, and lots more things that we need to discuss and learn from and prepare for the future with. But the question that we're dealing with now, when people attack the Soviet Union to use it to attack socialism, is the question of how did this movement, this incredible movement, this wonderful event in human history, where millions of oppressed and downtrodden people took power into their own hands, organised and took power, how did it become, how did it go towards what the Soviet Union tragically became? And Marxists have explained it. In October 1917, capitalism broke at its weakest link. The Soviet government, the workers, when they took power, they inherited a very poor country in a state of disintegration, ravaged by years of war, widespread illiteracy, poverty, and so on. And that really made the building of socialism much more difficult than it would be today, than it would be in any country probably of the world today, a more economically advanced situation. And it was clear to the leaders of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin, and so on, that there was no way that the revolution could survive based on one country, that the international spreading of the revolution was absolutely vital. And there were massive movements. And again, this is really important for today, because the movements that took place around the world following that event, the 1917 Russian Revolution, show how quickly a movement today would spread if socialism was achieved in any part of the world. And for example, in Germany, power was glimpsed by the working class, but they were defeated. And the main reason, you don't have a chance to go into all the details of that obviously today, but the main reason that happened was because there wasn't a party like the Bolsheviks that existed in Russia that was capable of leading that, of recognising what was needed by the revolutionary movement to go from step to step to take power. And that left the Russian Revolution isolated. And that was the principal cause of its degeneration. And like I said, these things weren't a shock to the leaders of the revolution, Trotsky and Lenin. And Lenin had warned beforehand that as well as not being possible in one country, that there were safeguards that were needed to protect the newly built workers' state from the rise of a privileged bureaucratic elite. Unfortunately, these weren't carried out, but they were based on the idea of democratic running of society in the hands of the working class, including things that would be useful for today, like Hannah's touched on, and the nature of the nationalised economies and industries and so on that we want to build, but free and democratic elections with the right of recall of all officials, no official to receive a higher wage than a skilled worker, no standing army separate to the people, and also that gradually for all administrative tasks to be done by all, not applied in a crude way, but to show how society can start to be organised on the very important basis of from each according to ability and to each according to need. And if implemented, those guidelines would have protected Russia from degeneration, and they, like I said, are very useful in thinking about what's necessary for democratic working class socialist planning that we urgently need today. But Hannah just touched on Cuba, and the other aspect of the Soviet Union that is usually ignored is the extent to which the planned economy, even in its distorted form as it developed, even to the extent that was able to develop the economy. And that's really important, the role of a plan, like Hannah just said. Because up until the 1970s, the nationalised economies of the Soviet bloc, so-called, produced impressive advances, especially in industry and so on. And they also were able to provide basic education, healthcare, and other amenities that were, really advances unparalleled in any capitalist country at that stage. There were many social advances, women's rights, LGBT people, the rights of oppressed nationalities and so on, but those gains were destroyed by Stalinism and the restoration of capitalism. And then in the aftermath of that, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, we had that period of huge, enormous triumphalism amongst the defenders of capitalism, saying that this proved there was only one way of organising society. I wasn't a member of the Socialist Party at the time, but I understand that it was a very difficult time for socialists, but it was absolutely necessary for us to maintain and to draw out those lessons of what had gone wrong, and to prepare and to maintain the socialist ideas for times like today, actually, when it's absolutely necessary that an alternative to capitalism is required, that capitalism is not capable of organising society in a way that can keep the health and the safety and the rights and the future of the overwhelming majority and the environment safe. So I suppose what we're saying is that, today we're in a world where capitalism has provided tools which, would really help the building of a genuine democratic planned economy. But even that, today, we've been using Zoom for a lot of the Socialist Party meetings, but that's not a nationalised democratic facility, which it needs to be. And so there are risks apparently involved. And also, like Hannah was just saying, big business continues to use the technology that's been built up to sell things, to make profit, to prioritise profit over social need. And that's why we've got to draw those lessons out of what happened after the Russian Revolution to prepare for the socialist transformation of society that we're posed with fighting for today. Okay, did you want to add anything on that?
Just very briefly, because I know we're talking for quite a while. Obviously, as Sarah said, if you're going to pick the central reason that the Soviet Union degenerated, then it was the fact it was left isolated and on its own, and attempts to transform society in other countries failed. But that does have lessons for today. That's why the Socialist Party doesn't just organise in England and Wales, but is part of an international, the Committee for Workers International, that organises across the planet, because the struggle for socialism and against capitalism is a global struggle, not just in one country. Having said that, I think it would be much easier to spread socialist ideas on a global basis today than it was back then because of technology. Of course, they try and stop word spreading, but you had one country that broke with capitalism and actually begin to build a society that met the needs of its population. That would spread like wildfire. It would be enormously popular and I think would very quickly spread to other countries. And just one other little point on this question of planning, because people who are arguing against socialist planning will always say, well, look, it didn't work in Russia. Because while it's true that the economy developed very rapidly for a period of time, it was bureaucratic. All the stories about people would get 5,000 left boots and no right boots and blah, 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 which are not made up. They all happened, But of course, that's primarily because of a lack of democracy, that there was not workers' democracy. It was Stalinist. It had degenerated. A precondition for real workers' democracy is having a working week that is short enough that people will have time to take part in society. But doesn't this crisis show that people are willing to take part in society if they're given the opportunity? So that's the central reason. But I also think the point Sarah made about new technology and how we could use it are really important. I mean, this seems like a trivial example, but we've all got supermarket loyalty cards. They're used to organise just-in-time production so they can bring across what they think that we're going to spend our money on and maximise their profits. We've seen the problems with just-in-time production in the current crisis. But what an aid to finding out what people actually wanted in order to not have 1,000 left boots and no right boots, because people would say they wanted, both feet, just by using that kind of technology that exists today. So it's a completely different situation. That was a silly example, but you know what I mean, than existed back in 1917. I'll leave that there.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Anna, it's really good that you mentioned about linking up with socialists across the world through the Committee for a Workers' International, and people should definitely go to the website of that organisation, the Socialist World Organisation, socialistworld.net, and have a read particularly of the statements that have been produced on the coronavirus crisis. And I've just got one last question before we shut up for today, and that is to Hannah, that you're the General Secretary of the Socialist Party, and some people watching this might be wondering, why is the Socialist Party continuing to produce a weekly paper, The Socialist? Why are you carrying on doing things like this when, a lot of people might just be trying to focus on day-to-day life, getting through this crisis? Why is the Socialist Party carrying on? How would you answer that, Hannah?
Okay, it's a very good and important question. Obviously, this is a time of crisis, and working class people around the country and around the world are consumed with what this means for them, both the health of themselves and their families, but also their jobs, their lives. However, that doesn't mean that the Socialist Party should pack up and go away till the crisis is over. On the contrary, in times of crisis, socialist ideas are needed even more than in normal times. And it's always the case, whether it's a war or a war against a virus, that when you get a crisis, the capitalist class try to say, now is the time to all unite behind us. Don't make a fuss, don't complain about workers' interests, just concentrate on uniting behind us until we're through this crisis. Back Boris and keep stum. That's what they'd like us to do. But actually, this is when we need to organise even more than in normal times. Sarah mentioned earlier on the cold cruelty of the British ruling class, and that has always been the case. You go back to the Irish potato famine, when they were still exporting wheat from Ireland while Irish people starved. They've got a long history of being very cruel, and it's no different in this crisis. Their initial reaction was the same as Bolsonaro is still maintaining in Brazil, a very right-wing president there. It was, let's wait for herd immunity to develop. Many of your loved ones are going to die, like Johnson said in the first press conference, and we're not going to do anything about it. And that's what they would have done. The reason they shifted tack was because they realised that there would be a mass uprising of the working class and Johnson would be booted out of office if they tried to continue down that road. So they shifted tack under our pressure, but the working class has to keep that pressure up to fight for the necessary action. As we've already mentioned, it has been the working class up and down the country who've been fighting for proper health and safety measures, sometimes by having to take industrial action to win that. And it was ever thus. They keep going on about the blitz spirit. Well, the Financial Times, where the bosses talk to each other, had an article which the headline of which was "Blitz spirit is a load of bunk," which is a Financial Times type of way of saying it's a load of old nonsense. But the point they were making in it is there was a blitz spirit, but it was among the working class. There was not a blitz spirit across the whole of society. On the contrary, while there were lovely shelters built under the Ritz and in the big fancy hotels, there were no shelters for the working class in the East End of London, for example. And there's a very good article in this week's Socialist, which, as Sarah said, we're absolutely still producing, which describes the reality where it was our forerunners, supporters of Leon Trotsky, who fought, for example, for the deep tube stations to be open to at least give some protection during the Blitz to work for working class people. And today, in the pages of the Socialist, you can read about how workers are fighting back in this situation up and down the country. And that's at a time when, unfortunately, most of the national trade union and Labour leaders have fallen into the trap of national unity, of let's back Boris and keep quiet until a later date. Just at a time when trade union membership is going up because trade workers know they need the defence of their organisations in this time of crisis. Workers realise that, and the best way for any worker, join your trade union, absolutely. But if you want advice on how to fight back, if you want the experience of other workers in similar workplaces up and down the country, then you should be reading The Socialist, and we would say joining the Socialist Party as well. So it's vital that we keep going during this crisis, that our paper reaches particularly those workers that are still in the workplaces, but also the nearly 1 million who are having to apply for universal credit. And in Italy, they've gone from a mood of national unity and singing on the balconies, which was very nice, but now to food riots in the south. And we could see the same here with what is developing with the scale of mass unemployment. So it's important for now that we keep going, but it's also even more important for the future. It's not the subject of today's broadcast. We need to stop, so I'll be very short on it. But look, let's be clear. This is a huge crisis of the capitalist system that is developing. Nearly 10 million people becoming unemployed in 1 week in the US. 1 million here in Britain. That is a dramatic crisis of the capitalist system, which is going to mean huge misery for the working class. But it is also going to lead to major radicalisation of people thinking this system doesn't work and we need an alternative, and starting to look for socialist ideas. So we need to keep going for the crisis now, but we also even more need to keep going for what's coming afterwards, when there will be the possibility of building mass support for socialist ideas and building a movement that is capable of transforming society. So I hope you've enjoyed our broadcast today. If you want to know more, get in touch, apply to join the Socialist Party or come to our meetings locally. Take out a subscription to our paper, The Socialist. We can have it delivered through your door every week. But we would also say, please, if you can, make a donation to keep the Socialist Party fighting fit. Maybe some of you have had to give up your gym membership because the gyms have shut. Well, you can give that to keeping the socialist movement fit instead by handing us a donation. We know many people have nothing, have been thrown out of work and can perhaps only give us a very small amount, and every penny counts. But there are others who perhaps can afford to give us a day's pay or more, and we ask, if you can, please do donate via the Socialist Party website, because we've never needed a fighting socialist movement more than we do today.
Thanks very much, Hannah, and thanks everybody for watching. We aim to be back with you next week, technology allowing, and we look forward to hearing your questions, your thoughts, but also just to echo what Hannah said then, please join us. Get in touch, join at socialistparty.org.uk, and we can put you in touch with people in your area to go to a Zoom meeting. Please subscribe to the Socialist paper and to Socialism Today, but also please donate to us, help fund the Socialist Party, the socialist voice standing up against the capitalist chaos of this coronavirus crisis. We're only funded by working class people. Everything that you can give us, we will put into making the socialist voice, the socialist alternative, clearer as much as we can. So thank you very much today. Thank you, Hannah. Thanks to our team, and hopefully see you soon.